Welcome to Virtual Fridays at 5. We are delighted that you have decided to make this leap with us. I am Judy Williams, co-president of the Friends of the Hampton Library, and I'm greeting you during what is surely the most unusual Fridays at 5 author series in the last 36 years. This summer, 4 wonderful authors agreed to pre-record their talks for people to view on 4 consecutive weekends. The focus this year is not on fundraising, but rather on the continuation of a long library tradition. However, if you would like to donate, just hit the donate button now and give at whatever level you are comfortable with. And if you're excited and intrigued by what you have heard this weekend, you can purchase all of the authors' books on this site. And now my co-president, Frances Jones, will tell you a bit about this weekend's speaker.
So it's sometimes hard to remember that the East End began as a farming community, but we do remember when we get to go by all the gorgeous farm stands and find delicious fruits and vegetables. And because we're invested in that, I'm so excited about tonight's author, who wrote a book called PERILOUS Bounty. It is about the looming collapse of American farming, but luckily, what we can all do about it. So I'm hoping by the end of his talk, he's taken us onto a bit of a deep dive onto how we got here, but also shown us what we can do to make everything better.
Hi, my name is Beth Eisenstadt, and I am the Regional Development Director at Mother Jones. And I'm here today with our food and agriculture correspondent, Tom Philpott, to talk about his forthcoming book, Perilous Bounty, out on August 11th. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Beth, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm doing all right.
Great, so tell me about this book.
Yeah, so I've been working on this book probably since 2017, and I'm really happy to have a galley in my hand, and the actual hard copy will be coming soon and out on August 11th. And yeah, so I just thought I would describe what's in the book, and we can just have a conversation about it. So basically what my book is, what it does is, in broad terms, it traces the way that really powerful institutions, essentially powerful economic interests, corporations, dominate the food system, dominate the sort of machinations behind the scenes to deliver foods to our plates. And they're pushing the ecologies that the food system relies on over a cliff, is what I argue in the book. And so, what I ask you to do is sort of look at a typical plate of food in the United States, whether it be a lunch or a dinner. Typically you have a piece of meat on the plate, and then, over to the side, some vegetables, and maybe some fruits mixed in. And so sort of the basic components of a meal. And so what I do is I look at the 2 growing regions in the book that are responsible for the great bulk of those 2 things, fruits and vegetables on one side and meat on the other. And so for fruits and vegetables, the region where we get them, where, no matter where you are in the country, no matter what time of year it is, really, when you go to the supermarket or go to a restaurant, it's quite likely that the fruits and vegetables that you're eating will be from California. That is the sort of dominant place where fruits and vegetables come from. And so in the first section of the book, so I devote 3 chapters to it, I talk about the sort of political economy of food production in California, focusing on a region called the Central Valley. Beth, when you go out to California, have you ever been to the Central Valley?
I have been there once when I was a child, but it's been a long time. Usually my trips to California are pretty focused on San Francisco, where our colleagues are.
That's right. And I think that really is a lot of people's experience with California. So the Central Valley is this massive valley that goes up the middle of the state. And on the one side of it, you've got the coastal mountain ranges. And on the other side of it, you've got the incredibly beautiful Sierra Nevada mountain range. And so in between it is this huge, many hundreds miles long valley that goes sort of north-south up California. and very, it's not a tourist attraction. People might go through it to go to the Sierra Nevadas, which are beautiful, and there's a lot of great parks over there. Or there's one, the main way you get from LA to San Francisco, you drive through it for a good portion of the trip. But most people don't go there, and it is probably the second most important food production area in the country. The other one is the topic for later chapters. And so the Central Valley is this massive long valley, responsible for a huge portion of the fruits and vegetables we eat, the nuts we eat, stuff like salad greens, a lot of the stuff that we're supposed to eat more of, broccoli and cabbage and things like that. A lot of it comes from the Central Valley, and also increasingly nuts, especially almonds and pistachios, a little bit of walnuts as well. And so what I do in the book is I start with giving us a little bit of a history of the area. And when you go through it now, it looks like basically a desert in bloom, because it's in the summertime, it's really hot and dry. And if it's not an agricultural field you're looking at, it's going to be parched because the place doesn't get any rain at all. I mean, it gets very, very little rain in the summer. And it could not look any more different than what it looked like when US settlers took over California in the middle of the 19th century. We have completely transformed it. So what it was like before is you've got this incredible mountain range of Sierra Nevada that collects snow all winter. And then when the summer hits, when the spring hits, going into summer, the snow melts, and that melted snow cascades down the mountains. And in pre-US times, it fed these massive rivers that crisscross through the Central Valley. And then also a lake that was the biggest lake west of the Mississippi. It was called Lake Tulare. And it's, so part of it would cascade down the mountains and feed this terminal lake. The water would stop there and feed a couple of other lakes, but it wouldn't flow out to sea. And the other part of it would, rush through these rivers and end up in the San Francisco Bay Delta and going out to sea. And the area was the site of many tribes of Native Americans. It had huge amounts of wetlands. It would get so much water in the winter, and so much water in the spring when the snow melted, that it was this incredibly biodiverse area. So even though it didn't rain in the summer, there was water gushing through it all the time. There were massive amounts of wetlands. Apparently just a paradise of birds and wild animals. Like I said, a large population of Native Americans lived there, doing a little bit of farming, but mainly just sort of, fishing and hunting and things like that. And actually when the Spanish grabbed that area a couple of centuries before, they really focused their attentions on the coast. They set up their missions all along, you can still see them today, from Southern California up, all the way up. And they didn't really mess that much with the Central Valley. There were some incursions into it. There was a little bit of cattle ranching that went on, especially later, getting into the 19th century. But the presence was fairly limited, and the water flowed freely.
Verdant, lush, and full of wetlands is not how we think of the Central Valley today.
Not at all. And the number of, sort of the square mileage, it was something like a third wetlands. Just this incredible area. And so basically what happens is, to make a long story short, US settlers take it over. There's the gold rush that happens in 1849. Statehood comes along not long after that. There's a booming market to grow food for the the Niners. And so you get this, basically agricultural, white settler US agriculture interests take it over. And the rest of the history of it has been basically channeling that water and turning the floor of the valley basically into a desert, and channeling it for agriculture. Some part of it does go, some part of this Sierra Nevada water does go to cities, but 80% of the water that moves around in California from one place to another, and most of that is Sierra Nevada water, goes to agriculture. And I talk about how, this was not a project of the free market. It wasn't like, some interests got together and said, hey, let's build a bunch of canals and dams and aqueducts to move this water around. These were multi-billion-dollar public projects that happened in the 20th century. And so I go through that story, and then I talk about how basically the 20th century, so in the 20th century, we get this boom in farming in the area, and we get, there's a transition from ranching to, cattle ranching and, stuff like cotton and wheat, mainly to fruits and vegetables and increasingly nuts. And so this happens over the course of the 20th century with the building of this incredible infrastructure. There's a Central Valley project, which is a federal project, and a state project, and both of them were multi-billion-dollar public investments that farming really could not happen on any kind of scale there if they didn't happen. And then I get into a little bit into the ecology. And so what it turns out is the 20th century, when this sort of agricultural behemoth builds up, turns out to have been a very wet century for California. If you look back, and I go into some of the science of it, and if you look back over the last, many thousands of years, California has had many, many mega droughts. And so, what happened was that there's this incredible resource of this snow melt in the Sierra Nevada that was coming in, great quantities for most of the 20th century. And we built this agricultural behemoth out of it. But the agriculture interest got so big and so ravenous for water that they also did one other thing. And that was they tapped underground aquifers in the area to supplement the snowmelt. And so these are, you can imagine an area with so much water gushing through it. Some of that water seeps down underground. And so there's essentially these massive lakes under the area, which is another just incredible resource. It's like a jewel. And so these agriculture interests are like, well, we've got this snow melt that's a little bit, it's sort of there's good years and bad years for the snow melt, but the underground water is always there. And so they tap into it with wells, and they basically early in the 20th century, before the canal infrastructure came in to capture the snowmelt, they were freely tapping into these aquifers, and they were doing it at such a rate. This is in sort of first half of the 20th century, that the ground started, as the water was extracted, the ground starts to sink, and it's called subsidence. And you got massive subsidence, like several feet, like the land sinks several feet. And you can imagine the problems caused by that. It snarls up roads and bridges and canals. And so, that was one of the impetuses for the government to invest in these canals, was like, okay, if we can deliver water in a reliable way from the Sierra Nevada, the farmers won't be digging these wells so much, and we can stop subsidence. And so actually, by the 70s or 80s, subsidence was under control in the Central Valley. And basically, they weren't overtapping the underground water resources. They were mostly living off of the Sierra Nevada, and things were in a bit of a balance for a while. But then I go into, so that was the situation heading into, let's say, the 21st century, that, yeah, there were some problems, there were some drought years, there was some over extraction. But what happens in more recent decades as climate change, sort of takes place. And with climate change, what you get are lighter and lighter snowpacks. And so I've got numbers in the book showing that that not only were there massive droughts, but good years got less good. So you get this like steadily declining snowpack. Meanwhile, agricultural production just continues booming and taking more and more water. And the subsidence problem returns with a vengeance. And it was already happening before the 2000, there's a massive drought between 2011 and 2015. Mm-hmm. They were already overdrawing those resources then. And then when that drought hit, that epic, worst drought in 500 years, worst drought since European contact with the continent, subsidence on a grand scale, especially in the southern part of the Central Valley, came back to basically levels that last seen in the 1930s. Land sinking, oftentimes in some places a foot per year.
So what has that meant for residents of the Central Valley?
Well, it's meant, there are in my travels for the book, I saw houses that were damaged by it. But what it mostly means is infrastructure that gets fouled up. And so, basically who pays for it when when part of a bridge sinks more than another part of the bridge and it gets messed up? Well, the California state government goes in and pays for it. And something else that it's meant, these aqueducts that draw the water from the mountains and bring them out to the farms, they're all based on gravity. They're all based on the giant drop from the mountains to where they're going. And so when you get subsidence in these aqueducts, and you get places where it sinks a little bit, so subsidence is real inconsistent. It'll sink more in some places than others. And so what you get is they are wasting significant amounts of water from the mountains that should be going to farms because of the subsidence. And it's going to cost billions of dollars to fix it. And so what you get is you get a feedback loop where farmers aren't getting as much water from the mountains. And so they're tapping more underground. They tap more underground. There's more sinkage. Yeah. There's more sinkage. There's more snarling of the aqueducts. They perform worse. More water spills out. And so you get this feedback loop. And so what I show is that there are a bunch of scientists that have been looking at the climate in California. And what they find is that the problem of the snowpack getting lighter and lighter is only going to get worse. And we're going to lose half the snowpack. We've already lost a significant amount of it, but by 2050, according to a couple of different studies, significant amounts of the snowpack are going to be lost. And so you're in this situation where agriculture has gotten accustomed to using way more water than the ecology can actually provide. And then, so that's kind of in the first chapter. Then in the second chapter, I go into this whole problem of the sort of mirror image of the drought problem, I should say. And that is massive flooding because the thing about California's weather is that it's really based on things that happen deep in the South Pacific where it's really, really hot and getting hotter. And so what happens is water evaporates in the South Pacific and comes, this is going to sound like I'm exaggerating, but I swear to God, this is what the science tells us. It shoots over in these essential, like, airborne rivers of water. They call them atmospheric rivers. And people in California are familiar with that term, but they come over in atmospheric rivers and basically these massive surges come over to our continent and they basically hit against the Sierra Nevada and dump rain, but they can only do it like for basically 4 months in the winter because there's high pressure zones that push it basically up to the Pacific Northwest where it's wet all the time and down a little bit lower. So there's basically this 4 month, channel, this 4 month window where California gets this weather. And what the science is telling us is that they'll be getting fewer and fewer events in that time, which means less and less snow because the water basically hits the Sierra Nevada and dumps the snow. So that's the drought problem. The flip side of that is that these events, while they are going to be fewer, are going to be a lot more extreme. And we're already seeing that. And there is a thing that happened in the winter of 1861 and 1862 that scientists are recently getting super interested in. And that is, there was so this is, let's go back to history of California. California has barely been a state. I think it became a state in 1860, if I'm not, somewhere
Sounds right.
around that time. California has not been a state for very long in 1861, 62. It's a fairly new state. Basically, San Francisco is the main population center. And it's fairly sparsely populated. The Central Valley still has, many Native American tribes. Agriculture is pretty, there's some cattle farming being done to supply, the population center of San Francisco. It's fairly sparsely populated. Sacramento's already the capital. And it starts raining in December. And it just doesn't stop. It was like a kind of an unusually warm winter. And so what happens is this rain comes in and just starts pounding Northern California. And I think it actually extended to Southern California. This massive storm that goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And when it hits the Sierra Nevada, it pummels down on snow and starts to melt and release snow. And so what you get is this flood that is like literally out of the Bible. It filled the entire Central Valley. So you're talking about an area from not that far from Los Angeles, which is where the Central Valley starts. When you're driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco, you drive maybe 30 minutes over some mountains and you're in the central, maybe 45 minutes, and you're in the Central Valley. And it goes all the way up near the border of Oregon. This is, a massive area, and it becomes essentially a giant bathtub.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And thousands and thousands of cattle died. And there's interesting, I was able to find some good contemporary accounts. And there's accounts of Native Americans, catching wind that this is going to happen just based on their own way of reading the land and reading the ecology and fleeing for higher ground. And the white settlers going, well, why did they just leave? And then, suddenly this hits, and this massive flood hits and completely buries the Central Valley. It did create a very interesting moment in agriculture, because still at that moment, so when when California becomes a US state, the citizens of the state of California, the Mexican state of California, became US citizens. There's a lot of racism against them. And what cattle ranching was happening in the Central Valley was basically done by them. And there were white settlers who wanted to get into it and were trying to break into it, but these former Mexican citizens basically held most of the land, and they got completely wiped out by this flood, and all their cattle were lost, and they basically lost their land because they couldn't afford it anymore. They couldn't afford to farm anymore, and sold it at cut rate prices to white settlers. And that's really how white settlers took over the valley. It was like this cataclysm. And because cattle ranching was so cleaned out, and it takes a while to build up your cattle stock, there was also a major shift because of that storm from cattle to wheat. Because wheat was something you could throw it down. It was fairly, it could grow pretty well in a dry climate, as it was very dry in the summer. And so basically the flood set the current course of agriculture. It it handed land over to white settlers, and it changed everything from cattle farming to, actual crop farming. But so scientists, basically this event became lost in the, sands of time. We talked to people from California, they've never heard of it. It's gotten some more press recently, But the fascinating thing about it is that when you talk to scientists who study things like tree rings and, you know, the sort of fossil record, what they found is that there have been many massive floods of that scale in California over the past 1,000 years, that they happen about between every 100 to 200 years. They're really not that unusual. And according to some pretty strong science, the one that happened in 1861 isn't even on the same scale as some ones that have happened previously. And so they happen every 100 to 200 years. The last one happened in 1861. And so we're basically due for another one. And
yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that, you know, the same factors I was talking about earlier, climate change, giving us fewer but more extreme storms, makes it really likely. There's this scientist I quote in the book named Donald Swain from UCLA, who's done a study looking at the fossil record and looking at climate models. And, you know, he basically says there's an 80% chance that that something like that is gonna happen in the next 30 years. It could happen anytime. And there was a really big one coming out of the drought in 2016. There was a pretty massive storm that caused a lot of problems in California, almost caused a dam to burst in Northern California. The other interesting thing about this that I found fascinating was that there are policymakers thinking about it and trying to prepare for it. And there was a study by so there's this crew, US Geological Survey, which is a government agency, did a big study on the possibility of the next big earthquake in California. And they put a lot of resources into it. And the idea was to let's think about the probabilities and let's make sure that we're prepared for it. And as a result of that, everyone in California, like if you talk to the Mother Jones staff in San Francisco or people in LA, they will tell you, oh, I've got an earthquake kit. Everyone has one. There are pretty good preparations for it. People know that the big one could happen. Well, the US Geological Survey took a similar team and said, okay, tell us about the next storm. We'll call it the Ark storm, after Noah's Ark. Tell us what the probabilities are and what kind of damage it will cause. And what they found was that the probability of an 1861 style storm coming are higher than the next earthquake. So it's a more probable event. And the damage that it will cause is nearly $1 trillion. Whereas the damage, I think it was like $875 billion worth of damage. And the damage caused by the big one earthquake is about $250 billion. So it's going to cause about 3 times more damage. And so for the purposes of I think this is all really eye-popping. It really, in terms of the human toll, it really is concentrated on the Central Valley. So, San Francisco is not that much in danger from it, but the Central Valley was sparsely populated in 1861. Most of the population were Native Americans. We don't really know how many people died. It was a pretty chaotic situation. There's no sort of death count on it. But we do know that the population of the Central Valley is massive now. You've got Fresno, you've got Bakersfield, you've got other cities in the area. It's one of the fastest growing areas of California. As people get priced out of real estate in LA and San Francisco, people are moving there. So it's a super populated area, and the human toll would be much, much higher than it was in 1861. And it isn't really something that it's, really hard to figure out how to prepare for it. So there's the awful, human possibility of a massive humanitarian disaster happening there. For the purposes of my book, it's also where all this food production takes place.
Right, exactly.
And
the knock-on effects of our ability to have fruits, vegetables, nuts,
Yeah.
and the like will be huge as well.
It would cause a cataclysm in the food system. It would, I mean, it's really hard to get people to even speculate. But you're talking, and also think about the pesticides they weren't using
Yes,
pesticides back
exactly.
then. Think about the pesticide storage in the area. Think about all of the massive dairy operations that are dotted through the area. These are giant dairy farms and cattle farms for beef. Concentrating waste, concentrating manure in these huge lagoons. They've got factory scale chicken farming. Think of all that, a slurry of water through the area featuring all that stuff. It's pretty stunning to think about.
Who knows what the long-term toxicity then would be?
Yeah. Who knows what the soil is going to be like?
Yeah.
I mean, they're already abusing the soil. But yeah, I mean, so this is something, going back to my title, Perilous Bounty, like we're sort of basing our sustenance on this area that has got all sorts of, it's running out of water. And then it's got this, flood hanging over its head. And I just don't feel like at the national level, I don't feel like policymakers are thinking about this stuff. Like what would happen, what's going to happen if California really gets into another massive drought and a massive water crisis, and what happens if there is this massive flood. And then the last bit of my California section of the book, I go into just the way that in the midst of all of this, these massive economic interests are buying up land in California, basically replacing fruit and vegetable production, and also, to be fair, some cotton production, which there's really no reason to be growing a lot of cotton in the Central Valley. They're replacing it with these massive plantations of almonds and pistachios. And one of the problems with this is that if you are a cotton grower or a fruit and vegetable grower, and there's a drought, and you're not going to get your allotment of snowmelt water, then you can say, you know what, I'm gonna fallow this land. I'm gonna give this land a year off because it's going to be too damaging to use well water, and I don't have any access to groundwater. They call it water that comes from the Sierra Nevada. You can do that if you're growing crops because it's just 1 year. Maybe it's a couple of years. If you have spent millions of dollars, and I've got the numbers in my book about incredible initial investment it takes to put in an almond plantation. If you've invested millions of dollars in an almond field, an almond plantation, or a pistachio plantation, you can't say, oh, I'm going to fallow it this year, because your trees are going to die. You're going to lose that crop. And so what it does is, what the economists call it hardens demand for water. It means that when there's a drought, demand for water doesn't drop, it just keeps on. And so you get this pressure on the aquifer. And what you saw in 2011 to 2015 in that drought was you saw a boom in well drilling. People were putting in new wells, they were deepening their old wells, and the land was literally sinking. It's still sinking right now, but not as fast. But the next drought is right around the corner. We actually did not have a great winter in California for snowmelt. It's not drought levels, but I think it's like half of normal capacity, which is not great. So we could, anytime enter into a new drought. And so these interests are buying it up. And there's this, I used to be a financial reporter a long time ago. And there is this, what investors do, what sort of investment companies do is that they tell investors a story. They say, okay, here's the story on California farmland. Global population is growing. Population in China is huge. It's not growing very fast, but it's huge. And people are getting wealthier in China. People are moving up the economic ladder in China. And as they move up the economic ladder, they have more money to spend on food. And one of the things they want is almonds and pistachios. And the industries have marketed them heavily in China. They've done all these advertising campaigns and, gotten Chinese people in China don't think about snacks. Well, they've introduced them to the American concept of the snack. Like, hey, I got to have food up on my desk when I'm working my desk job.
We do like to share our greatest traditions.
That's true. And so, you've got this boom in almonds in California. And so what they're telling investors is, hey, look, they're not making any more land. California is one of the few places on earth where you can grow almonds at a vast scale. You basically need a Mediterranean climate to grow almonds. And California is one of the few Mediterranean climates in the world. And it's also got this incredible, you can tell investors, we've got this incredible water resource in the Sierra Nevadas. We've got, the land we're trying to sell you has all these wells on them. You've got a secure water supply. Let's, buy this land and we'll sell almonds to China and we'll all get rich. That's the idea. And so you've got retirement funds and hedge funds are going into it. There's a massive company called Wonderful that's really big in California. It's a privately held company. You've seen their material in the grocery store, usually in the produce aisle. Wonderful pistachios.
Oh yeah.
They are the key. This family, the Resnicks. There's a great Mother Jones feature by a colleague a couple years ago about them. They're incredibly politically connected. They are a massive landowner. And they are really good at, basically controlling water. They actually got hold of a water bank. If you can believe it, there's a thing in California that's called water banking, where basically you capture water in good Sierra Nevada snowmelt years. So you have it in bad years. And there's a publicly owned one that the Resnicks got hold of for not very much money. That gives them incredible power. So they can collect this water in good years and then disperse it to themselves for their own almond territory or sell it. And so while there's this bad ecological stuff going on, these very powerful moneyed interests are pushing the valley more and more into this water dependent way. And I argue in the book that this is a really bad thing for our food system, and it's something that we should definitely be thinking about more. And I'll get into maybe a little bit later that there was a legislative response in California that is important that I'll get to a little bit later. So the first, go ahead.
Go ahead. And I was just going to say, I want us to get into solutions, but I know there's a whole nother region.
There's a whole nother down region.
To talk about, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll try to speed it up in this region. So where your meat comes from, so the first part of the book is meant to scare you, like, oh my God, where are my fruits and vegetables going to come from?
Well, don't worry, it worked. I feel terrified,
okay.
So.
Then we shift into meat. And so where your meat comes from ultimately is an area that we call the Corn Belt. And the Corn Belt is centered in Iowa. It's the states that are right around Iowa. And it's a large region. And it is the source of 80% or so, this Corn Belt, not just Iowa, but the greater Corn Belt, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, a few other states, are the source of, upwards of 80% of the corn and soybeans grown in the United States. And a whole bunch of those corn and soybeans go into meat production. Unless you're some kind of farmer's market eating, know where your food comes from, person who's paying up for alternative meat, from that, the farmer down the road, the meat that you eat is grown with corn and soybeans that is grown in California. That's the feed for these animals. And what I show in the book, once again, I go into the history, and the Corn Belt is at least as tragic as, the shift in California from this incredibly biodiverse, wild, wet region that was the Central Valley into this sort of food growing desert that it is now. The Corn Belt was prairies and wetlands. It was this incredible region of really high grass prairies. And when we say high grass prairies, we don't mean one species. We mean like multiple species of not only grass, but also legumes and, incredibly beautiful flowers, incredibly biodiverse. Everyone knows about the bison, the, buffalo herds that roam there. The bison, they played a really important role in the ecosystem. They would They would munch down on the grass and recycle it in their digestive systems as manure that would recycle the nutrients. Also, by eating the grass down, they would, basically like help make sure that trees didn't grow there, that it would remain a prairie. And meanwhile, the grass, when they munch it down, the grass isn't dying. It was perennial grasses that are just digging these incredibly deep roots into the soil and creating one of the greatest stores of topsoil on Earth. And people played a huge role in that as well. There were, again, lots of different Native American peoples that were in the area that also played a role in managing the ecosystem by starting fires. They would, for various reasons, start fires. And once again, these fires would, regenerate growth in the prairie and make sure the prairie stayed a prairie, that trees didn't grow there. So, you've got these interactions of animals and people creating this incredibly biodiverse ecosystem that was really productive, just untold amounts of bison that Native American peoples lived hunting without affecting the viability of those herds. There was also agriculture conducted by Native Americans in a way that wasn't destructive. And then, basically you get, what I want you to focus on here is that all this plant growth and decay and activity by the bison and the manure created this, basically 6 feet of incredible topsoil. And where there wasn't prairie, there was, once again, wetlands that were, especially in the upper part of the, sort of northern Iowa into Minnesota, that were just these engines of biodiversity, incredible amounts of birds, ducks and birds of all kinds lived there, nested there, reproduced there. And so basically what you get is, essentially white settlement comes in and encloses the area, takes it over, takes it from Native Americans, slaughters, kills, drives away the bison into extinction, puts it under the plow, and creates the sort of land ownership structure that we have now that evolved over time into basically a bunch of different crops used to be grown there. Lots of fruits and vegetables were grown there. And it evolved over time under, basically under capitalism as we learned to get our vegetables from fruits and vegetables from California, from the vegetable production shrinks in Iowa and the Corn Belt. And now you get this massive amount of farmland devoted to just 2 crops, corn and soybeans. And if you go there, I describe in my book the first time I went there. I've been writing about the area for a little while. This is back in the mid-2000s. And I was just stunned. And the only thing I can compare it to is flying into Mexico City at night. When you fly into Mexico City at night, you just see this vast valley that is just, as far as you can see in all directions, that has been sort of urbanized by people. And you just, you think about the transformation of this landscape. Yeah. It's like that in Iowa. It is just but it's more interesting in Mexico because there's more variation in as you look around the city. In Iowa, it's just basically corn, soybeans, and hogs. There's like 1% of the old prairie still exists. Some tiny percentage of the old wetlands exist. They basically drain the wetlands. They literally put in pipes to drain the water out. And if you put pipes in the soil and drain the water out, now you can farm the land.
Right.
So the wetlands were drained for farming. And so, in the amount of time, 150 or so years that we have been there, we've burned through about half the topsoil. So we've taken that resource that we inherited and taken about half of it away. But then what happened around the time of the Dust Bowl, which is mostly in the Great Plains, but there was a lot of erosion as well in the Corn Belt too. And the government put policies in place to basically keep the soil in place because the Dust Bowl is this massive disaster of soil loss in the Great Plains. And the government was like, we can't keep doing this. And so there were some good New Deal measures put in place to encourage farmers to conserve land, to conserve their soil. And so the basic idea has been, oh, well, for the past 40 or so years, we've controlled the erosion problem. We're not losing a lot of soil. Everything's fine in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt. But what I show in the book is that is actually all wrong. That by just growing 2 crops, corn and soybeans, and leaving the ground bare all winter, it leaves the land completely prone to these massive spring storms that come in. And there the weather comes in from the Gulf, and you probably already figured out that it's getting hotter in the Gulf, meaning that there's more and harder storms hitting in Iowa. So these storms blow in, they pummel the bare ground, and the soil literally washes away. And I talked to a soil scientist at Iowa State University who's been documenting this. And basically what he says, this is guy named Richard Cruz out of Iowa State University. What he shows is that Iowa is actually losing soil at an average rate of about 16 times faster than it's replenished. So far from solving. And
that seems like an insurmountable loss to make up.
Yeah. And it's happening. And I saw it. I toured with him in this actually the summer of 2019, last year. There was a really bad, it was kind of like a terrible thing that was great timing for my book, because they hadn't had one of these while I was researching my book. They hadn't had a really harsh winter, wet, late winter, early spring. And one erupted last year, and I got myself to Iowa in June. And I was able to tour the fields with Rick Cruz in Iowa, around Ames, Iowa. And he would show me places, there'd be like a giant gap in the land. And he would say, okay, well, that's probably represents 15 tons of per acre of topsoil just gone, just like washed into streams and rivers. And then he would show me, he'd say, like, look at the land. The land was still pretty bare. There's, a little bit of a corn crop coming up, but it was stunted. And he would say, the parts that are rich black that you're seeing, that's like good Iowa land. But look all through, you see these brown spots. That's where the soil is eroded away. And in those areas, the crops aren't growing as well. But those areas are getting more and more as erosion continues. Basically his idea is that you can't just grow 2 crops over and over again and leave the ground bare all winter, because this is what you're going to get. And so whereas the problem in California is water scarcity combined with the potential for over scarcity in one massive event, in Iowa, it's basically there's a hidden, not very much talked about soil crisis happening in Iowa. And then I spend a good amount of time in the book asking, well, who benefits from this? Why are they doing this? Why are farmers submitting to this? And I decide that, it's not really the farmers that benefit. They're not making very much money. This corn and soybeans that they're growing tend to be priced very low, not very much higher, sometimes lower than the cost of their production. And what keeps them going is that the more land you have, the better you do in a good year. And so you make a little bit of money if you have a whole bunch of land. And so that's why farms in Iowa have gotten bigger and bigger. There's this consolidation in Iowa where small farms sell it to big farms, and you get bigger and bigger operations. You get, used to be a really big farm in Iowa. It was 1,000 acres. There's a great book by Jane Smiley, a novel called 1,000 Acres about Iowa in the early 80s. And at that time, 1,000 acres was a considerable farm. Now, 10,000 acres is like, okay, that's a real farm. And you got 20,000 acre farms. So there is that, but what really keeps those farms going is also government subsidies, basically billions of dollars of government subsidies. And so then you ask, okay, farmers aren't really making it, and mid-sized farmer, unless you're a big farmer, you're not making it at all. You're literally going out of business. And why is the government doing this? Like, why are we as a public subsidizing this catastrophe of soil loss? So I go through a section of the book where I show that there's a set of corporations that benefit massively. And think about the California gold rush. The people who really benefited were the people who sold the axes to the miners or sold beef to the miners, to get back to the farming theme. You know, that's axiomatic. The gold rush ended up being not that great for the 49ers, but fortunes were made selling stuff to them. And a similar thing's happening in the Midwest, where the companies that sell seeds and pesticides, genetically modified seeds, you know, things like herbicides, and the amount of pesticides that they use there is massive. Fungicides, they make loads and loads of money, huge amounts of profits. The companies that sell fertilizer, and the companies that buy the corn and soybeans at these really low prices and then turn them into stuff that's expensive. So they buy low and they buy low and sell high. So that would be meat companies. It would be, you know, companies like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill that buy corn and soybeans and sell it or turn it into meat or whatever they do. These companies all benefit. And what I show in the book is that it's been, for the last half century, ever shrinking number of companies that get bigger and bigger. All these markets, whether it's, you know, seeds and pesticides are combined into one set of companies. It's like basically Bayer, which bought Monsanto. Right. It's Corteva, which is a combination of Dow and DuPont. And it's Syngenta, which is owned by the Chinese government, and one other European company called BASF. But those are the big three. Basically they dominate the market for seeds and pesticides, and they make out like bandits in this, and they fight any kind of change. Like, hey, why don't we, you know, pay farmers to do something besides grow corn and soybeans? That's not on the policy agenda at all.
And their lobbying efforts must be outsized.
Oh yeah, massive lobbying efforts. The meat industry has, you know, been reading a lot about that. I was doing some reporting on it because of the COVID-19 crisis. But these companies like Tyson, a tiny handful of companies produce the great bulk of meat. And so they basically buy their corn and soybeans cheap, stuff a bunch of animals together, feed them to the animals, and then make a profit on selling you. It's more profitable to sell you meat than it is to sell you corn and soybeans.
Sure.
That's where the profit is. And we're seeing in the COVID-19 disaster how horribly they squeeze workers, and now the horrible working conditions, even in, you know, pre-pandemic times, and the pandemic just laid bare how they squeeze workers. And in my book, what my book does is shows how much they squeeze farmers, who then squeeze the land and are basically destroying the land for this, you know, to create, you know, this cheap meat. And then, you know, also everything, if you go into a grocery store and pick up a product off the middle shelves, the processed food shelves, corn and soybeans are in everything. They're, right. You know, I calculate the percentage of calories that come from corn and soybeans between the meat that we eat, the high fructose corn syrup, the corn oil, the soybean oil. Basically all industrial food uses soybean oil. And then the rest of it is essentially corn oil. And so our bodies, and, you know, Michael Pollan pointed this out years ago. I mean, our bodies are essentially, the average American is basically calories provided by corn and soybeans, in various forms, from meat to sweetener. And so, you know, like, why are we producing this low quality food that is making us sick and creating all these, chronic health problems like diabetes, heart disease? And it basically comes down to the economic interests of these companies are putting a stop to any kind of policy change. So you're supposed to leave that section of the book just going, okay, now Tom just took away meat, like, you know, basically.
You've basically taken away everything.
Yeah, like, we can't keep doing that to soil. So now what?
Yeah, I would love to hear, I'm hoping the third part of the book is about what we can do to fix some of this.
So yeah, the third part of the book, I go into the Corn Belt and I talked to some farmers who are doing things differently. And it's basically adding biodiversity to the mix, adding more than just corn and soybeans, adding animals to the land, adding other crops to the land, adding crops that grow in the winter to protect the soil. And I showed that they can be profitable.
Yeah, how do we create the economic incentives to do that?
Yeah, and that's when we ram our heads up against this giant lobby that we were just talking about. These incredibly powerful corporations, and there's good research about corporate consolidation, which is just companies getting bigger and bigger and dominating markets. One of the effects of it is it bleeds into the political sphere. If
Right.
4 companies control so much profit from an area, from a part of the economy, they can invest some of that profit in lobbying and campaign finance, and they basically control the political discourse and regulation around that. And so that's a massive problem. And so I also do some things in the book, like I couldn't get myself in too positive of a state for the 3rd section because I just kept seeing, I just kept seeing other things, like just how, people say, well, why don't we just import more fruits and vegetables? Like if California, Central Valley goes under, why don't we just go to Mexico?
But surely that creates problems in those places as well.
Yeah, and one of the
And contributes to climate change with travel and all that.
And one of the problems is that the growing regions of Mexico, where we get a bunch, we do import a good amount of our fruits and vegetables.
Sure.
They're literally right under California and have even worse, possibly, water problems. And right. I looked at the, Chile. You've probably seen in the winter.
All your fruit comes from Chile in the winter.
Yeah. And so, I did some research on that, and I was just like, oh my God, they're having a 500-year drought in that growing region in Chile. And they're replacing some of the fruit and vegetable production for higher margin. They're taking away some of the fruits that we eat, and they're doing higher margin avocados for the European and Asian markets. So they're already kind of moving away from the US to avocados, and that's going back to the same problems of hardening demand for water. Those regions are totally screwed up in water terms, those big production regions that we import from. And I looked at Saudi Arabia that said 20 years or so ago, hey, we've got this great aquifer. Let's make the desert bloom and grow our own wheat. We'll grow wheat in Saudi Arabia. We'll be less dependent on it. And then basically a generation, they completely tapped it out. And now they're importing a lot of wheat from the United States. They're also importing alfalfa for their livestock industry from California, in drought-plagued regions of California. So I couldn't help myself. I guess I'm a bit of a gloomy Gus. And I was getting into just these more problems and these big lobbies that benefit, these big corporations that benefit from the status quo. But then an idea, something started to change in basically going back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, but also manifesting itself in stuff like the rise of Elizabeth Warren as a national politician, Bernie Sanders sitting the national stage and running 2 serious but unsuccessful presidential campaigns. And that was suddenly we had space in our politics for people completely willing to rip all this stuff up. So like if you look at Elizabeth Warren's platform and Bernie Sanders' platform from the 2020 presidential election, they were, basically acknowledging all the problems that I've talked about, talking about, the thing with California that I came away with is that what we should do with California is just put resources into re-regionalizing fruits and vegetable productions in other places. Like
that's actually something I wanted to ask you about because you sort of start your book with this anecdote about back when you were a farmer and growing like local salad greens. And one thing that struck me about the stories that you tell in your book are the real loss of smallholder farming and local agricultural knowledge. And so I'm wondering, and it Sounds like you're getting towards a yes. How much of that we might be able to reclaim as we move into the future?
But I think it's a great question. And I think the answer is a lot of it if we put policy behind it.
Right.
And so if I mean, I think that, first of all, California, even if it has to pull back and grow less fruits and vegetables, it's always going to be a great place to grow fruits and vegetables. We're just going to grow fewer of them there because it does have that great Mediterranean climate, which is beneficial for a lot of things. You know, it's actually a benefit if you're a farmer and you have water, if you have access to water, growing in a desert isn't that bad because, you know, you don't have to deal with a bunch of pain in the ass summer storms that are pounding your fruits and vegetables, maybe bringing in fungal pathogens like, you know, basically fungal diseases that could cause rot in your vegetables. If you can push a button and make water flow, that's actually great. So I think that California is going to be great. It's just going to have to ramp down. Sure. And other regions are going to have to put resources into ramping it up. Like, you know, basically the Midwestern states can get together and say, hey, you know, there's research that Tom has in his book that we can basically satisfy most of our summer fruits and vegetable needs here in the Midwest without that many acres. We could devote 100,000 acres. If we said we're going to figure out a way to get 100,000 acres of fruits and vegetables, we're going to figure out incentives to get farmers to do it. We're going to find young folks that want to farm and put them down there. We're going to figure out ways to do it. They could do that. The South, the deep South has this horrible history of, you know, slavery, grown, you know, with enslaved people growing cotton and then later sharecroppers growing cotton under these really brutal conditions. I think cotton production, you know, there's this big global market in cotton production. We're no longer the cheapest producer in the world by any stretch. Cotton requires a lot of subsidies. And the way it's grown here, it's grown in monocrops. It's really chemical intensive. What if we made a program to shift some of that land in the South into growing fruits and vegetables for the South? You know, it isn't, none of this is easy. And it's going to require a lot of training and resources.
And political will.
We've already got the sort of basis for it. Like in my lifetime, I have seen us go from basically no farmers markets or just very limited farmers markets around the United States. So I grew up in Austin, and I remember there was one that was called the farmers market, kind of in the north part of town, this kind of industrial part of town, and only a few people went to it. And people would, you know, some small farmers would truck their stuff into it. And it would be like a supplement to growing for the grocery store. And now in my lifetime, since you've been an adult, there's been this explosion in farmers markets, and it's and it is I show in the book that is this amazing achievement that we've done it. It's not sufficient. It's something we can build upon with policy to take pressure off California and grow fruits and vegetables in more places. In Iowa, the answer is just diversification. And that gets down to policy. And so the way that I end my book is I think that people can vote with their dollars, right? And seek out producers that are doing things right and support their local farmers. But we've seen the limits of that. That's basically what Michael Pollan said in Omnivore's Dilemma. That's how basically how he ends up Omnivore's Dilemma in 2006. Well, it's been 15 years now or so, and we've seen where it gets us, which is somewhere not far enough. And so I end my book, my great moment of hope in the book at the end is the rise of politicians like Warren and Sanders and Alexander Ocasio-Cortez in New York, and the rise of an idea of a Green New Deal. And if you look at Bernie Sanders' proposal for a Green New Deal, he basically, it's as if he read Perilous Bounty and said, okay, we'll do what Tom said.
We should at least send him a copy once it's out.
We should. But it's basically, you know, put resources into regionalizing fruits and vegetable production, a push for victory gardens, which I wrote about recently on Mother Jones, but not in the book. Payments for farmers to store carbon in their soil. And the things that you do to store carbon in your soil are the same things that save soil from eroding. And that would be like sort of biodiversity and things like that. Planting more crops, working animals in. So in the CAFO system, animals are confined in a space and you have all these crops around. In a better system, they're mixed together. These are incredibly productive systems. And he, his Green New Deal would have resources for that. And so I finished my book at the, Sanders and Warren are still viable candidates. Sanders is starting to break out. So there's a sort of hopeful note. And then everything has changed.
So let me ask you this. Yeah. You wrote this book in 2019. A lot has happened since then, including both Warren and Sanders dropping out of the presidential race. And those are two of the smallest things that have happened in the last few months. We're now facing a huge global pandemic, not to mention a great uprising for racial justice. And all of these things are linked together. Of course, and that all comes on the heels of all the things that are still happening, like climate change and the economic problems that are being brought about by what's happening now. So I'm hoping you still got a little bit of hope in there for me, Tom, but a lot has changed. And how do you think that affects what you wrote about in the book?
It's kind of crazy, but I think I'm actually I am definitely more scared now than I was then because of all the stuff that's happened. But I'm also more hopeful in many ways. And I think the reason is that the coronavirus pandemic exposed so many things in our society. Basically this just-in-time society, like, oh, we don't need to stockpile stuff. We don't need to prepare for a pandemic. We can have this incredible economic growth that is obviously very unequal, and everyone doesn't participate in it. But our policymakers in power didn't care about that. We can just keep doing that, and the pandemic hits and exposes that as a lie. It exposes we need to plan for, like, bad things happen that we need to plan for, and I think that's hopeful. It ripped the veil off the food system in a lot of ways. Like, it exposed the horror that's happening in these chicken factories and pork factories to people that long predate the pandemic. The pandemic just tightened the sort of vice on these workers, and brought that into the public idea. And I think that now that we know that, I think that there's room for questioning other parts of the food system, like, oh, that's what it's doing to people. What's it doing to the land? I think there's room for my book in the conversation that's starting.
Yeah.
And I think that the movement for Black Lives, I think that it was accelerated by the pandemic because of the inequality of the pandemic, the way the pandemic is hitting African-American communities, and basically because of economic inequality. Right. It's hitting them, African-American communities, much harder than white communities. And then you get a police killing that is very graphically shown on video. And it was just this tinderbox, I think. And I think that leads to further questioning and further bringing everything open, out in the open. And I have to say that when Biden sort of took control of the race, this is just before the pandemic. Right. Suddenly, within a span of 2 weeks, it goes from being, almost an also-ran to in control. I was despondent because here was a guy who has campaigned this time and in previous times, but especially this time, vote for me and I'll restore the pre-Trump order. I will bring us back to 2016. Well, everything I write in my book was happening pre-2016. It was happening under Obama. It was happening under, all presidents. These lobbies were really powerful. The Obama administration did not do a great job of taking them on. Obama's USDA secretary, Tom Vilsack, was not a reformer. He was a go along to get along kind of guy. So it's like, oh my God, now Biden's won. First, the last section of my book is destroyed. That my only hope was sort of a Green New Deal. It's not going to happen under a Biden. But then the pandemic hits. And I think Biden had, at least his people, his, campaign managers and political advisors now realize that going back to the pre-2016 status quo isn't going to cut it. And because of the economic catastrophe that I think we're in the very early phases of, we're going to have to see, and Biden has talked about the need for a new Deal. He hasn't said Green New Deal, I don't think, but he has talked about another New Deal, another mass government mobilization. Because I think the unemployment rate is going to continue going up. We're going to continue seeing a destruction in demand, which is going to lead us in this. And we have, the Washington leadership doesn't want to spend any more money, so we're kind of stuck in this stagnation. And I think if we do get a President Biden and a Democratic Congress, I think we're kind of back to where we were when I finished the book. I mean, I think a lot of the ideas that Sanders and Warren talked about are going to come to the fore. Like, okay, we need to spend trillions of dollars to get the economy moving again. What are some of the ideas lying around, to quote a famous economist in the 20th century, Milton Friedman, in a very different context? What are some of the ideas lying around in this crisis? And I think some of those ideas that are in the Sanders and Warren policy statements on agriculture could come around again. And then also, I think the social movements that are happening, like basically the whole Sanders idea was, I can't do this alone. I need a social movement around me. And I think there were legitimate questions like, dude, where are you going to get this social movement? Like, where's it going to come from? Well, now I think if there's an we already have this budding protest movement over structural racism in society. I think it is causing a lot of questioning. I'm seeing a lot of liberal commentators that were maybe not open to questioning the need for, really strong government intervention are now talking about Green New Deal-ish ideas.
Yeah.
And I think that the social movement that I couldn't quite see in, let's say February of 2020, I think we're starting to see it all around us. And I think that we could see political momentum that gets at these policy changes. And so the bad news in my book is I'm not going to let you off the hook to say, hey, go to the farmer's market and shop at the farmer's market. Because that's not going to get us far enough. And a lot of people can't do it. They don't have access to it. They don't live close to it. They don't make enough money to do it. We're also about to be in a situation where there's going to be a lot less expendable income. I'm not going to tell you to shop at the farmer's market if you are struggling to put food on your table.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you to get the best food you can get with your money, whatever it is. But so that's not, consumerism isn't going to get us there. We're going to have to organize, and we're going to have to, I think Biden is a politician. Roosevelt wasn't some wild-eyed lefty quasi-socialist when he got elected. He was an establishment figure who was like, my God, I'm presiding over this catastrophic economy. I got to do something. And he, needs some people that were around, and a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, and they came up with these ideas. And I think that Biden has a similar potential. I think he could be someone who never thought a subversive thought in his life, never thought a really challenge the power structure thought in his life, will be put in a position where that's the direction he goes. And I think that is the hope that I lead you with. And with the, as I say at the end of the book, yes, vote with your fork, but also vote with your feet. Get out there and join that social movement.
Yes, absolutely. Well, on that hopeful note, I'm going to say thank you for talking to me about your book. I'm really excited for it to get out into the world and for everyone else to get to read it as well.
Thank you so much for listening to me for so long.
No, it was great.
I was also, okay, well, let's end it now. And